Good morning, brethren. It's a joy for us to share the word of God together. As David said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. For David knew the benefits that he derives from going into the house of the Lord. And I always say that Sundays like this, or the church, is like a workshop where after a week of long tiring and walking around, we come here to service ourselves. And for those of us who are lacking encouragement, we get encouragement for ourselves. The service that we get help us to be able to go through the week ahead of us. And so it is always important for us to make it a point to meet with Christians so that we can share the word of God together. This morning, our reading, as we heard, was taken from the book of Job, chapter 21, verse 1 to 5. And I'm talking about listening. That's what we're going to focus on. And the book of Job is one of the interesting books in the Bible. It is one of the famous stories that you can find in the Bible, very popular among Christians. Though some believe that it's not a real story, but the Bible, the evidence from the Bible itself attests to the fact that Job indeed really lived and went through the difficulties and the challenges have been articulated in the story. For even within the New Testament, Job's name is mentioned that yes, he persevered, and in the Old Testament as well. So it is a story about a man who was tempted beyond human measure, and yet he maintained his integrity. In the story, Job is introduced as a wealthy and a righteous man. Satan challenged Job's integrity. He went for a permission or contested with God that indeed Job is righteous, and because of the wealth that God has given to him. So he contested that, and God said, yes, indeed, you can put him to test. And in the first test, Job passed that test. Satan went again. So at that material moment, all the possession, his family, everything was wiped off. Satan went back, but Job maintained that integrity. And Satan had to go back. And then God asked him again, and he said, yes, that is true. But a man will give everything for his life. So God said, then you go and test him again, but this time around, not his life. So Satan brought in a lot of disease upon Job, but he was able to maintain his integrity. But faithfully saying, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So that is the story about Job. Even Job's wives denied that, and he asked him to curse God and die, but he refused. So sometimes we look at why did Job have to suffer that way. So Job is a typology of Jesus Christ, suffering for righteousness' sake. But in all this, he maintained his integrity, and the word he did not sin, which is usually applied to Jesus Christ, is referred to Job. After going through all these difficulties, and his friends, there are three of them, they made an effort to go and console him, and want to just read what they did, which was very, very important because they saw that their friend was in hardship and they needed to console him. And so they made an attempt to go and do that. So when you read Job chapter 2, Job chapter 2, verse 11 and 13. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So that was an interesting scenario where his friend made an appointment to go and console with him. Realizing the difficulty, they sat down for a whole week without a word, and they sprinkled themselves with dust, that to show the degree of sadness that has filled their hearts. But the later story turns out to be very bizarre based on the interaction that they had with him. Why? Because they turned out to be what their aim was to go and console with, comfort him and sympathize with him, but Job described them as miserable comforters. They were there to comfort him, but their comfort was not enough. So that was because instead of comforting him, they came to lecture him and accuse him of sinning. And their speeches are in 3 cycles, as Job turned out to address each of them one after the other. There are some lessons that we can learn from the book in general. And one of them is the fact that the book of Job can help us to see that God is still God. No matter the difficulties, no matter the challenges that we go through, God is still God. Everything that happened to Job occurred because God allowed that, for that to happen. And so nothing, or no matter what happened to us, we should take consolation in the fact that God is in control and that He will not allow anything or any circumstances to go beyond our measures. Secondly, we can also, the book can also help us to develop a good relationship with God. When tragedy happens to us, there are two things that can happen. Either we are drawn closer to God or we are drawn far away from Him. Job was frustrated. He questioned God. He expressed his frustration and anger and hurt to God through the communication he had with friends. And indeed, Job wanted to meet God one-on-one. But the interesting thing is that when God appeared to him in form of miracles and questioned him, he realized that he was not able to even answer one of the questions that God put to him, which is very interesting, that he wanted to have an engagement. He even needed somebody to have that interaction, but God later appeared to him. But in all this, just a way of expressing his frustration, but he didn't sin there. So that is one thing, or some of the lessons that we can learn from the book. Also, the book can also help us to always praise God and never take our blessings for granted. Sometimes, if you look at what is happening around us, the war around some nations, that we find ourselves in this situation, can we imagine if we are in, let's say, Ukraine and Russia? Can we have that peace of mind to even come together and worship? So imagine those Christians there. Do you think they find it very convenient and safe to go and worship God? Whatever that happens to us, whatever blessings that we have, we need to appreciate the fact that yes, we are blessed and that whatever difficulties that we are going through, God is with us, and therefore the blessings, everything that we have here in this country, we shouldn't take that for granted. We should also, one thing that we can also learn from the book is that God does not want to be misrepresented. The friends of Job said a lot of things about God, but later on when God appeared to Job, he said that there are a lot of things that these friends said because their philosophy and the things that they were saying were not based on the word of God. So they were misrepresenting God, and God accused them and even asked Job that he should pray for them. And so God, we are ambassadors of God, as that is what Paul described as in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20. Christians are ambassadors. We are the representative of God. And so we should reflect God. We should represent God correctly in the way, in our words and in our actions. In our words, we can do that when we can only represent God truly in our words when we are able to study his word, and then as Paul told Timothy, that study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that need not to be ashamed, but rightly dividing the word of truth. So when we do that, then we can actually represent God, but in our actions as well, we should also reflect the compassion, the love that Jesus also showed to us. So these are some of the big picture lessons that we can learn from the book of Job. But today we want to focus on some specific lessons that we can learn from the chapter that was just read to us. And it is about listening and bearing with one another. That chapter 21 is a response to the second round of speech. As I told you, if you read the story of Job, after the three friends had come to console him, sitting down for a whole week without any word, later on they began their lecture. So one after the other, each one will speak, some for long hours, and then Job will also respond to that. So that was in chapter 20, that was the second round of speech by Zohar. After implying, he preached, and then the implication of the preaching was that Job was suffering because of his wickedness. And so that was the response Job gave, and I just want to go over that quickly as we listened a while ago. Job then answered and said, keep listening to my words, and let this be your comfort. Bear with me, and I will speak. And after I have spoken, mock on. As for me, is my complaint against man? Why should I not be impatient? Look at me and be appalled, and lay your hand over your mouth. So Job, I think I like the NIV version. Job said in chapter 2, listen carefully to my words, and let this be the consolation you give me. So Job realized that his friends were not actually listening to him. And so listening is very, very important, and bearing with one another is also very important. There are two words that are used interchangeably, hearing and then listening. But there are some subtle differences that can manifest. When you talk of hearing, it's just a physical act that requires one sense and has to do with perception of sound. So there are some sounds that we can hear even as I'm preaching now, there are a lot of sounds that I can hear. That one, it's just passive. It's just a response of your ear to the sounds. So hearing is like collecting data. We hear sound and words all day, even though we are not paying attention to them. But when it comes to listening, the definition involves active and paying attention to words and sound that you hear to absorb their meaning and develop an emotional response. So listening is very active process. You make a conscious effort to understand what the speaker is saying. So Merriam-Webster defined listening as to hear something with thoughtful attention. To hear something with thoughtful attention. Perhaps we have been asked, or someone has asked us this question before. Are you listening? Are you listening, children? Are you listening? So more often, teachers tend to ask this question, and it comes when the speaker realizes that the listeners are not really paying attention to his words as they are supposed to do. And so we find an interesting story about listening when you read Samuel or 1 Samuel chapter 3. That's a story about Samuel who is to be mentored by Eli, and he found himself in the temple, and Lord calls him, and he realized that somebody was calling him. He thought it was Eli, his mentor. He went back to him and asked whether he's calling him, and he said no. He went back again, and the voice came back. And the third time, Eli realized that yes, I think it's something the Lord is calling to. When he comes, just hear, just respond. Speak, thy servant, listen. So God really is interested in our listening skills and what we hear. For example, let's read Mark chapter 4, verse 24 to let us know that God is actually interested in the way we listen. Mark chapter 4, verse 24, it says, and he said to him, pay attention to what you hear. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and still more will be added to you. So God wants us to pay attention to whatever that we hear. So paying attention and listening carefully is very, very important. He wants us to listen to his word because it is through that we develop faith. But the Bible says faith comes by hearing, and by hearing the word of the Lord. So we need to listen carefully, and through that we can develop our faith. But most importantly, he wants us to listen to his son. God wants us to listen to his son and then obey whatever that he has told us. God is interested in how we put into practice what we hear. For if you read the book of James, it says that we should not just be listeners only, but we should be the doers of the word. So it's not only good to listen. Whenever we listen to something, we must take action as it is. It is an active process. We need to take action based on whatever that we hear. So when Jesus was evaluating the churches in the Asia Minor, the 7 churches in Asia Minor, after all the evaluation, there was a last word that the writer always put. He who has an ear, let me hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So most of us have talked to a person, as I indicated earlier, and we realize that that person is not listening. And perhaps we have poured out our hearts to someone, and then we believe that they have not heard us or understood us. This is the kind of frustration that Job experienced in chapter 21 as we read. And throughout every speech in this tragic ordeal, Job had maintained his innocence and his integrity. Yet his friend did not believe him. For the second time, Zophar has falsely accused him of being wicked. He wanted to convince Job that God was punishing him for his behavior. And so if that was the verse or the chapter 21, I just want to read an excerpt of that to see the kind of words Zophar was preaching, and that is why Job has to call his friend attention for them to listen. Verse 26, it says, total darkness lies in wait for his treasures. A fire unfanned will consume him and devour what is left in his tent. The heaven will expose his guilt, and the earth will rise up against him. A flood will carry off his house, rushing waters on the day of God's wrath. Such is the fate God allots the wicked, the heritage appointed for them by God. So that was the mentality of Zophar, preaching indirectly to the fact that Job was going through all these difficulties because he has acted wickedly in one way or the other. And so, and it's not surprising that God said they were misrepresenting him, because they were attributing the fact that Job was suffering because God has approved, or God was actually doing that because of what Job has done. And so that is why Job said, and that was the response that Job gave in the chapter ahead of us, which is the chapter 21. And so Job said, listen carefully to my words. I've told you several times that I haven't sinned, but you guys are not listening. So one of the major problems in communication is not listening well. Sometimes interruption prevents us from giving our full attention to what is being said. And so there are some few guidelines that I found that I want to share with us. And I found it from mindtools.com about how we can listen and pay attention to in every sphere of communication, be it our relationship with our spouses, friends, co-workers. There are some key important lessons about listening that we need to do. First of all, one of the things is to pay attention. If you want to listen and listen carefully, we need to pay attention. We need to give our undivided attention and acknowledge the message. We need to recognize that non-verbal communication also speaks loudly. Sometimes they say action speaks louder than words. So that is one thing we need to look. We need to look at the speaker. If you are paying attention, we need to look at the speaker and put aside distracting thoughts. Sometimes we will be listening, but our minds and thoughts are not on the message. We are thinking about something else. That is not an active listening, and that is not a good listening skills. Then we don't also, whatever situation that we find ourselves, we don't also develop or prepare a mental rebuttal. So when somebody is speaking, you are also finding fault and look at how you can respond to that person. We also need to avoid being distracted by our environment. For example, side conversation, having a conversation with somebody. We need to listen to the speaker's body language. So that is some of the steps that we can take to listen carefully or actively when we are having a conversation with somebody. Then we also need to show that we are listening. How do we do that? We need to use our body language and gestures to show that we are actually interested in the message, we are engaged in the message. We can nod occasionally, we can smile using some facial expression, and make sure our posture is open and then is also interested. We can encourage the speaker to continue with verbal comments like yes, some words like that, to show that we are actually interested in the message. And then also we can also provide feedback. We need to provide feedback, and as a listener, our role is to understand what is being said, and this may require a reflection on what is being said and then asking questions. Reflect on what is being said by saying or paraphrasing, what I'm hearing is, so you are trying to, if you are having one-on-one conversation, you are trying to understand what a person, try to summarize what he's saying. It sounds like you are saying, so it just gives an impression that you are listening and then you are providing feedback. These are some of the ways you can reflect on what is being said. Asking questions is also a way to provide feedback. What do you mean by saying Is that what you mean? So these are some of the things we can say, and then we can also summarize the speaker's comment periodically. And then we need to defer judgment. That was what the friends in the story were doing. They were always accusing Job of something that he hasn't done. We need to defer that. Interruption is a waste of time. It frustrates the speaker and limits the full understanding of the message. So we need to allow the speaker time to finish each point before even we ask questions. And then finally, we need to respond appropriately. Appropriately means active listening is designed to encourage and respect for understanding. You are gaining information and perspective, and therefore you add nothing by attacking the speaker or otherwise putting him down. So we need to be careful, candid, open, and honest in our response. And then we can also accept our opinion, but it must be respectfully. What we realize is that Zophar and all the friends actually did not follow these good listening skills or techniques. They were very judgmental and offered only rebuttal to the thought that Job has shared. Job did not need that at that material moment. What he needed is his friend to be able to listen carefully and sympathetically. And that is why he described them as miserable comforters after staying 1 week without any words. So Job said, bear with me. After telling them to listen carefully, he told them in verse 3, bear with me while I speak, and after I have spoken, mock on. We need to bear with one another. Christianity is one another religion. We are encouraged to love one another, as Jesus said in John chapter 13, verse 34. Let me go over and read that quickly. John 13, verse 34. We need to bear with one another. That is what we are encouraged to do. So one of the things, another passage is for us to love one another. John chapter 13, verse number 34. A new command I give to you, and that you love one another, just as I love you. You are also to love one another. So what we are saying is that we are to bear with one another. Job said, bear with me. So if you want to bear with one another, then, as I said, it's one another religion. And so one of the things that we can do for one another is to love one another. Moreover, we are also encouraged to be kind to one another. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, it says we should be kind to one another. Ephesians 4, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. So as whatever relationship that we find ourselves in our friendship with another, with friends, colleague workers, families, we are to love one another, and we are to also to be kind to one another. In our workplaces, we are to be kind to one another. So these are some of the things or the principles that we are to engage in as Christians. Moreover, we are to bear one another burden. The friends came in to, as it were, comfort Job. But in the end, they were very judgmental. So Job had to tell them or remind them of what they came there. Bear with me. So they were not bearing with him. So we are encouraged to bear one another burden. Whatever challenge that your friend has, for us as a family, we also need to know that it is also a burden for all of us. We shouldn't allow one person to carry that burden. We should all bear it. For there is a saying in our, trying to record that in our local language. If two people carry something, it becomes less burden, becomes less heavy. So that is what Christians are supposed to do. If a friend is in need, we need to help him or her bear that burden. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Also, one another, things that we can do for one another is to bear one another burden. Bear one another burden and so fulfill the law of Christ. So as I said, if somebody has a burden, we are all to help the person to carry that. And moreover, we are also asked to encourage one another. Sometimes life becomes very tough, become very difficult for us to move. And therefore, when we meet here, that is why I said, when we come here as a church, it is a workshop. So when we meet and we see our friends, we are asked to encourage one another. We should spend time and communicate with friends, and through that, we'll be able to know the difficulties and encourage them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11 talks about what we are to do for one another as Christians. And it says that 5, verse 11, it says, therefore encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. So I know we continue to encourage one another, as Paul was telling the Thessalonians. So I'm also telling us this morning, in Pakistan, we know we encourage one another, but we should continue to do that. Let me go over the verse. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. So just as we spend time during the break time and we have interaction, we need to do that. But more importantly, we need to listen. It is only by listening carefully that we can help bear one another. Job's friends had not been encouraging or kind to them. They had not been bearing with him, nor had they helped him to bear his burden. In suffering, Job needed to share his thoughts, feelings, and his innocence. Job admitted that he was disturbed and needed his friends to be patient with him as he talked about everything that had happened to him. So in one of the one another passage is when you read Romans chapter 12, it also encourages what we are supposed to do as Christians. And there are one another things that we are supposed to do. And in Romans chapter 12, verse 15 and 16, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind towards one another, and do not be hasty in your mind. Do not be wise in your own estimations. So we are also encouraged to rejoice and weep. Whenever our brother or sister is in difficult situation, we are supposed to. When that person is happy, we are supposed to also be happy. We are supposed to bear one another burden, encourage one another, and love one another as well. Zophar had not been practicing all of these principles. Job needed Zophar to bear with him and listen to him, but he had no confidence that the friends would be sympathetic towards him after hearing his response. Job said, look at me and be appalled. One of the things about good communication, if you want to listen to somebody, we need to look at the person. And looking at the person means that we are not just looking, but we are looking with sympathetic eyes. We are looking to understand. There's a saying that words, or as I did indicate earlier, there's a saying that action speaks louder than words. Sometimes a person may You ask the person, how are you? The person say, oh, I'm fine. But if you look at the demeanor of that person, you see that something is wrong. And that is why we need to be careful. We need to look carefully. If we want to listen to somebody, we need to listen and look carefully at what, so that we can probe if there's something that we can need. Sometimes people tend to gloss over. They may have an issue, but they are not willing to share. Unless we probe further, unless we look at the person's body language, then we'll be able to know that the difficulty or the joy that the person is going through, they'll be able or willing to share. So Job said, look at me and be astonished. Horror takes hold of my flesh. You see a brother or sister, he comes to church, but maybe he's wearing something like a mask over the body, over the difficulty that the person is going through. That is where we need to look carefully and listen carefully, so that we'll be able to help that person with the challenge or the difficulties that he or she is going through. Once Job had the attention, after putting all these questions to his friends, he began to address Job's second speech, point by point. He did a masterful job of questioning them, especially Zophar. He concluded his speech by asking, how then will you really comfort me, for your answers are full of falsehood? So the friends went there just to comfort him, as we saw in the earlier stages. But in the end, they turned out to be judgmental in their thoughts, in their actions. So the good intention that they had turned out not to help, as Job described them as miserable comforters. Initial stage was very fine, but their conversation that they had did not really help. So we need to listen carefully. For those say, how then will you comfort me if your answers are full of falsehood? We need to be plain in our language. We need to be careful when we are having an interaction with somebody, or especially when that some person is in pain. In that way, we'll be able to provide the needed comfort and support that we are to bear for one another. In conclusion, as I indicated, as Christians and in our relationship with friends, families, co-workers, we need to be empathetic listeners. Not only hearing, but looking and watching actively. If you want to be good comforters of friends and families, we must learn to be good listeners. We must be kind and encouraging, bearing with those who are struggling, and we must look closely at the circumstance of each other, so that we can offer the needed support, be it materially or spiritually. May the good Lord bless us. May He strengthen us to be able to listen carefully and help bear one another as we go through life in this world. Thank you.